Okay, and we're live.
Fantastic.
Awesome. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first broadcast of the Coderetreat training channel. My name is Aline, and I'll be your host for this evening. With me today, we have Alistair Smith, who is going to tell you everything about what a Coderetreat is, what a facilitator is, and what you need in order to facilitate one. So, hello there, Alistair. Thank you for joining.
Hi, Aline. Good to see you again.
Good to see you too. First, let's introduce you. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. So my name is Alistair Smith. I am a software developer based in Cambridge in the UK. I founded the software crafters community here about 6 years ago or so now, and have been running it and being involved in coordinating it for all of that time, really. I work primarily with C# on a daily basis, but also a bit of JavaScript and a bit of Python here and there, Golang, yeah, a bit of everything really. I've been running. Sorry, Aline.
Yeah, go ahead.
I've been running Coderetreats for about 5 or 6 years now. We've taken part in the Global Day of Coderetreat here in Cambridge, I think every year since about 2012 or something. So yeah, looking forward to it again this year.
Awesome, awesome. Before we go into the topic, I just want to let everyone know that if they have questions, please post them in the chat, and I will check on them from time to time, and I will ask Alistair those questions.
Mm-hmm.
With that out of the way, Alistair, take it away. Tell us everything we need to know.
Yeah, okay. So to start off with a bit of an overview of Coderetreats in general, it's a really fantastic format if you've not been to one before. It's a day-long workshop essentially of deliberate practice around software development, and the day is split into sort of 5 or 6 different sessions of about 40-45 minutes each. And throughout the day, everyone works in pairs and practices software development on the game of life pattern. So the format was devised by Corey Haynes a number of years ago, and he's got some really interesting posts about his experiences running Coderetreats, and a fantastic book called Understanding the 4 Rules of Simple Design, which sort of condenses his observations from watching people take part in Coderetreats over the years. It's yeah, the point of a Coderetreat is to practice the act of developing software, and so each session within the day will have different constraints that are placed on it. So, for example, it might be that you have to work in 2-minute increments in baby steps, as it's called, or you might have to work without your mouse for the next 45 minutes, or you're not allowed to use if statements, or one of various different constraints, sometimes more than one constraint as well. And the point of these constraints is to get you to explore different ways of programming, and looking at problems from different perspectives by removing something that you are very used to using, like the if statement, for example. As far as this training session is concerned this evening, what I'm going to do is take you through a sort of storyline that I use for my Coderetreats when I run them. And I've been using this, I think I've used it in 3 or 4 Coderetreats now, and I've found that it works really nicely. So I think I'll just launch into that now.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep, that would be awesome.
So here we go. So this is the exact set of slides that I used in the Global Day of Coderetreat last year, which took place this particular Coderetreat at Wikimedia in Berlin. I was lucky enough to be able to stay there and facilitate the Coderetreat there last year. So during this opening slide, what I tend to do is introduce myself, much as I already have, and explain a little bit about the Coderetreat as well as I have. What I also like to do at this point is to thank the hosts for the Coderetreat, because without them it probably wouldn't be taking place, and they've usually sort of forked out a not insignificant amount of money for the food for the day, for example, as well. Yeah, so a quick word of thanks to the hosts and to the other sponsors as well, and describing the format of the day as well. Something that is also useful to include at this point is a quick introduction, a round of introductions for the group, so that everyone can sort of get to know each other a little bit, learn each other's names, break the ice, etc. So just a very, very quick introduction from everyone, what their name is, where they're from, and maybe what they're looking to get out of the day as well. So after that initial introduction, I introduced the game of life, which is the exercise that we use for Coderetreats. And we use the same exercise throughout the day and in every Coderetreat to take the focus off the specific problem that is being worked on, and place the focus instead on the process of solving it and writing software to tackle this problem. So I give an overview of the rules of the game of life, but also try to ensure that people understand that solving this is not the aim of the day or any individual session. This is just the framework in which we are learning about our craft, really. The very first session that I do to sort of get people warmed up and introduce the problem, the problem of the game of life to them, is to start with a paper exercise. And this I've found has really helped people to visualize the problem and the way the rules interact and the evolution of a game as well. So the idea with this is to really explore the game of life as a system, essentially, to experiment with it, try different starting configurations, and just learn a bit about it, essentially. I give the following sort of hints in this exercise, because these particular patterns, these starting patterns, will become useful later on in the day of the Coderetreat. So here we have 6 different starting patterns which have different behaviors. So on the left we have the block and the box, I believe they're called, and these 2 patterns when you apply the rules to them, don't evolve over the course of a game of life. They are just static configurations of an environment, essentially. The next two from the left, the horizontal line and the sort of circular shape below it, have a phase, and the horizontal line is what's called a blinker, and that sort of rotates 90 degrees each on each generation of the game of life. And the one below it is, if I remember rightly, called the toad, and that sort of compresses and expands over the course of generations. Whoops. The next two are a bit more interesting. So so the second one from the right, the sort of two right angle shapes, is a beacon. So it flashes a light, essentially, and is quite fun to play with. And then the one on the rightmost is sort of one of the most famous of the patterns from Conway's Game of Life, which is the glider, and this actually moves across the board as the game evolves in a period of about I think 3 or 4 steps. So these are really useful examples, essentially, for people to try out if they get stuck picking their own examples. At the end of each session, I do a very brief retrospective of about 5 minutes or thereabouts, and in that I try to get people to introspect over the course of the session that they've just done, and have a think about what it is that they learned in the process. And some of the questions that I use at this time, in this particular retrospective, things like what did you learn from the examples that you tried? What did you try any of the suggested patterns that I put up, and did any of them take you by surprise at all? After the retrospective, we move straight into the next session, which in this case is an intro or refresher for test-driven design. So the original definition of the Coderetreat was that it was for programmers to come together to practice pair programming, test-driven design, but overall the 4 rules of simple design. I have generally found in the Coderetreats that I've run that TDD is not something that people are completely comfortable with. Some people have used it a few times. Some people have sort of tried it a bit and then stopped. Other people have used it quite a bit, and some people have never heard of it at all. So I take this second session as an opportunity to introduce the concept of TDD, the practice of TDD, how it works, and the sort of rhythm of it, essentially. Underpinning this is this quotation from my first year computer science lecturer, Introduction to Programming, and this is one of the few things that have actually stayed with me from my time at university, which is that code is not how you tell the computer what to do, it's how you tell another programmer what you want the computer to do. It is code is a language, it's a communication mechanism more than anything else at all. And so I get people to think at this point about how many times they read a line of code. The fact that code is write once and read many, and the fact that any line of code that is written is read orders of magnitude more than that one time, because every time you review the code or open the class up for work on it, or debug through a line of code, it is being read again, and then that is kind of multiplied across the entirety of your team, etc. So so here I'm really trying to encourage people to think about how to express themselves and communicate to other people the intent of what they're trying to do, rather than to sort of focus on the implementation of it, the nuts and bolts of how it hangs together. The 4 rules of simple design, as I mentioned before, is the main focus really for the Coderetreat day, and these rules were defined by Kent Beck some time ago, and are a really nice way of capturing the essence of good code, essentially well-designed code. The very first one is that it passes all of the tests. So this implies that we are writing tests to go with our code, of course. It expresses every concern that needs to be expressed. This ties back to the previous slide about code needing to reveal its intent, to clearly demonstrate, convey what it is it's trying to do. The third rule is that it contains no duplication, and this is duplication of knowledge rather than duplication of code necessarily. So this is a very common driver for the refactoring stage of TDD, and it is yeah, it's a really kind of good way of minimizing the amount of code that is needed. And then number 4, related to that, is to minimize the number of moving parts. So to ensure that there are no classes that don't have a particular role in a system, that, or functions that are unused, or don't interact well with the rest of the system, etc. I like to emphasize at this point that that building software is cheap. It is really cheap. It is so cheap, in fact, that we often don't realize we're doing it. Building software is the act of compiling it, taking the raw material of the text that has been sort of drawn up into a blueprint, which is the class or the source code that you're working from, and compiling it is the actual building step. And sometimes that doesn't happen until even it's executed, in the case of interpreted languages and languages that are just in time compiled, for example. So very frequently we confuse design with building, and the code that we write is as much design as drawing boxes and arrows on a whiteboard. Everyone in software is an architect, and we can use the 4 rules of simple design when applied rigorously to ensure that we design our code well. So I then introduced the concept of TDD and the rhythm of it as well, and the way that it works with the red-green refactor cycle, writing a failing test, writing just enough code to make that test pass. And at this point, I sort of hammer home the fact that just enough code to make it pass can be returned false if that's what you need to make the test pass. It is the smallest amount of code that you can possibly write. And then tidying up, refactoring. I try to get people to to organize into pairs where one person can mentor the other if possible, and to help them to learn together. Essentially, it can be very difficult if you've got a pair who are both completely unfamiliar with test-driven development, and that can require a lot more sort of hands-on facilitation with them as you're sort of wandering around the room. I sort of emphasize at this point that TDD is simply described, but it's not necessarily an easy thing to do. It does take a certain amount of practice and discipline to kind of get into, and this might be the attendees' first experience of TDD. Generally speaking, throughout all of the sessions in the day, I will be wandering around the group, kind of having a look over the shoulders of each pair, answering questions that they have about the game of life, or the 4 rules of simple design, or TDD, or anything else that they're sort of currently stuck on. And then that can provide useful information, I guess, for the retrospective at the end of the session. Something that's very, very common in the Coderetreat is to, particularly at this early point in the day, is to use the description of the rules of the game of life as a kind of specification for the system. And generally speaking, what I've found is that this allows you to get so far into the game of life, but doesn't. But then, after about the 3rd or 4th test has been written, you then find that you have to write the entirety of the game of life in order to pass that last test. So at this point, I sort of asked people what their experience was, and how they approached the problem, and what happened when they'd finished writing the implementation for their rules and the test to go with them as well. And also see if anyone else started from somewhere else at this point, because there's sometimes the odd pair that will kind of surprise you and look at it from a completely different angle from previously. So yeah, again, after the retrospective and a very short break, we go into the 3rd session before the lunch break, which is the baby steps exercise. This is a fantastic exercise that was devised by Adrian Bolbwacker, and it forces you to work in very, very small, very tight increments. So to work on a baby steps exercise, you need 2 things. You need a Git repository for your solution, and a timer of some sort. And thankfully, most phones these days come with timer apps on them. So you start off by setting the timer for 2 minutes, and you write your first test, and you try to implement that. And if you manage to do that within 2 minutes, then you commit that change and start another 2-minute increment. If you have red tests, including compilation failures, when the timer goes off, then you have to git reset hard and throw away the work that you've just been doing, because you've tried to bite off more than you can chew of the problem, essentially. So the aim of baby steps is to get you to work in very, very small increments and break the problem down into very small, very manageable chunks of work. And I like to think of those increments as sprints in a sort of agile process. And so I sort of extend this a bit to require that at the end of each 2-minute increment, there must be something of value that has been produced. So I sort of put the product manager hat on, and as the pairs are working through this, I'll sort of ask them what they're shipping me at the end of the current increment, and that sort of helps people understand the intention behind some of the agile practices, such as sprints, and the principles like continuously delivering value and only shipping working software, that sometimes get a bit lost in a Scrum transformation, for example. So I give them a bit of a hint at the start of this session, because, as I said, generally speaking, the rules are not a good place to start. So I sort of try to lead them into picking the first test that they write in this session with the end of the session in mind, and how can you deliver me a minimally functional, a minimally functional game of life that passes all the rules. And so what I'm looking for here is for people to at the end of the first increment, ship me essentially a system that only works with the empty environment, that has no live cells in it at all. Because that in itself is a completely valid game of life that adheres to all of the rules, and represents a good baseline for building up the rest of the system from there. So a good second scenario to tackle after that one would be something like the block or the box that we saw from the paper exercise, because again, that is a completely valid game of life that that obeys all of the rules, but doesn't have any dynamism in it. It's just a completely static thing, much like the empty game. And using this sort of higher level example-driven approach from the system perspective, it is generally much easier to deliver working software and continuously deliver value as well. So that is the baby steps session. Again, 5-minute retrospective, and in this particular one, I like to sort of encourage people to think about what was different about this particular session versus the previous one, and not just in terms of the sort of pressure and the stress of working in 2-minute increments, but also the way they tackled the problem and what they thought of the different approach if they chose to take it. So that is 3 lots of 45 minutes, and that is, generally speaking, lunchtime. So we spend about an hour on lunch to allow people to unwind, let their kind of brains relax a bit again and recover from the intensity of the morning, and also socialize a bit with each other, to sort of get to know their fellow participants and colleagues a bit better. So that's lunch. Immediately after lunch, I bring in TDD as if you meant it. and this is sort of TDD on steroids, essentially. This adds further constraints to the red-green refactor rhythm of TDD, in as much as it requires you to write all of your production code within your tests. So the very first test that you write needs to pass within that test function itself, with no external classes or methods or anything that it depends on. The next test that you write needs to do the same thing, but once you've got that test in place, you can start leaning on the refactoring step of TDD to extract methods and then classes, as you find duplication across the tests. I generally refer people back to the 4 rules of simple design here, because they interact with TDD as if you meant it in subtle ways. So you might remember that one of the 4 rules of simple design was no duplication, and that it minimizes the number of moving parts. TDD as if you meant it is a really good way of getting those rules to pass, just because of the way you are writing the software. Interestingly, I have found that this is easier for people that have little to no TDD experience to grasp and to get along with, than it is for people that have had some more significant exposure to TDD and have maybe tried TDD katas themselves, for example. I think this is because of the extra constraints that TDD as if you meant it place on the process of writing code, and I think it sort of offers more in the way of sort of training wheels, or a sandbox environment, if you like, for people to try the TDD rhythm out. So again, at the end of this session, we have a retrospective. Things that I like to ask people in this are: what refactorings did you use most? What was the main driver for refactoring your code? And that will almost always be duplication. And also whether people found this an easier exercise or a harder exercise, and why they felt that. It's an interesting exercise to run, and it's people have interesting experiences from it as well. The second session after lunch combines baby steps and TDD as if you meant it, and this is sort of the pinnacle of the mental intensity for the day. So this session, I start off with a reminder of how TDD as if you meant it works, and a reminder of how baby steps works. And with the combination of these 2 constraints on the one session, especially if people choose to use the example-based approach to tackling the game of life, it gets very close to sort of the utopian ideal of agile software development, where we are continuously delivering value, where we are shipping working software on every increment, and we are test driving the whole lot with 100% or very near 100% code coverage. Again, a retrospective at the end of this, and something that I like to ask here is whether people find baby steps easier or harder with TDD as if you meant it, and why. The reason being that, generally speaking, some portion of the group will have found baby steps very difficult to get on with, and another proportion of the group will have found TDD as if you meant it very hard to get on with. but the additional constraints of the other half of the exercise in this particular session can sometimes free people a little bit, because they've got such a small kind of environment in which to work in, that it suddenly all comes together, and they start to see how things work, and are more productive in this this session. For other people, it's too much, and it is yeah, they find that they abandon one half or the other in order to get something done, or sometimes both. In the last session of the Coderetreat, I like to let people pick their own. I've previously tried to do a variant on the game of life. There are a few described online in various places. I think Wikipedia might be the best resource for alternatives, but things like multi-species life, or three-dimensional life, or I think one of Adi Bolbwaka's favourites is sort of wormholes in the environment, or something like that. There's yeah, there's a lot to choose from in that respect, and it can be fun to kind of extend the problem a bit further. Generally speaking, I've found that particularly with the combination of baby steps and TDD, as if you meant it in the previous session, people are generally very tired at this point. They've been working for sort of 6-7 hours with just the odd break here and there, and a more significant lunch break, but sort of allowing them to pick their own constraints for the final session allows them to kind of relax a bit more again. And some of the things that you can offer as sort of examples for constraints to revisit one of the previous sessions, for example, or to use the constraints from object calisthenics, which is a really good paper with I think 9 different rules on how to write very, very object-oriented code. Other ones that you can use are things like void methods only, and yeah, there's a whole raft of them that I think are published on the Coderetreat website already. So yeah, I essentially allow people free rein for this last session. And we do a retrospective at the end of this this session as usual. And one of the things that I like to ask people at the end of this session is whether they reused any previous constraint, and whether it was conscious or unconscious as well. With the final break between sessions, I ask people to think about the questions that I'll be asking in the closing circle, and these are the 3 questions that were defined by Corey Haynes as part of the Coderetreat format, and I haven't seen any reason to vary them myself. They are succinct and introspective, and the answers to them are invariably interesting, and also don't take up so much time that you can't do this with a reasonably sized group in more than about half an hour or something. So the 3 questions are: what, if anything, did you learn today? What, if anything, surprised you about today? And what, if anything, will you do differently after today? And once the closing circle has completed, that is the end of the Coderetreat. So I generally finish up at this point with another thank you to the hosts and to the sponsors and the any co-facilitators that I've had. And generally speaking, I will, if it's one Coderetreat that I've hosted myself, as they were in 2016 and earlier, I will have arranged to go to the pub with the group as well afterwards to for a bit more socializing and discussion and decompressing as well. It is not always fabulously attended on the basis, well, for the simple fact that everyone's completely knackered by the end of the day, myself included. But again, this sort of varies by community, really. I think so. The Cambridge community, we sort of maybe get a handful of people at the end of the day, whereas I know in other communities there've been much larger ones. I think when I did it in Berlin, there was a significant proportion of the group that went to the pub afterwards. So yeah, it's an optional sort of addition on the end if you think you and the attendees will be with sufficient energy to carry on after the end of the day. So that is how I run a Coderetreat. That is the end of my slides. And hello, Aline.
Hi. Yeah. Thank you for all the things that you taught us. There's no questions so far. I hope this thing works, the chat. Let me double check. And I'm going to ask if there's any questions. And while we wait for that, if there's anyone having any questions, I am going to ask you a bit, how was your first Coderetreat, the first Coderetreat that you facilitated? Can you tell a little bit about that?
Yeah, of course. So, Ollie, that was a while ago now. Yeah, it was very different from what I've just presented. It was much more haphazard, and with much less thought put into it. I essentially did a bit of research into Coderetreats and how other people have run them and what constraints have been used, and essentially picked 6 constraints to run with the group over the course of the day. I think the biggest and most significant change that I've made since using the kind of random set of constraints kind of format is the addition of the paper exercise. That one was something that was listed fairly low down the list of constraints on the original Coderetreat website. And I thought, you know, people are here to program. Why are they going to do a paper exercise? And then I thought about trying it one year, and actually it turned out to be really good, really useful. Talking to my colleagues in the Cambridge software crafters community, I know that they ran the same paper exercise at the start of the Coderetreat last year in Cambridge, and found it really, really useful then as well. So yeah, in the very first one that I ran, as I say, much more haphazard, much less organized, much more seat in my pants, I think.
But even so, nothing wrong happened. The sky didn't fall down, did it?
No, not at all. No. everyone had a really good day. There was good turnout. Everyone had something that they learnt by the end of the day and shared in the closing circle. Yeah, I think the only thing that went wrong was that I forgot to do any of the video link ups during the day, because it was a global day of Coderetreat one again.
Right, but that's not mandatory for it. It's just something optional to join in with a video link to see and to be seen within the global day event.
Yeah.
And we're not talking about Coderetreats in relation to the global day of Coderetreat, are we? We can also have Coderetreats outside of that event.
Absolutely.
So,
yes.
Right. Anytime that you have people willing to practice their craft, you can set it up and run it.
Yep. Yeah, I've run a few at my previous employers before. So yeah, it's a really good exercise to run with your team at work, as well as with friends and colleagues from the community as well. So yeah, any excuse.
Okay, so no questions as far as I can see.
Okay.
I guess that means we're going to wrap it up. Thank you once again for offering to present this evening. You can find out more about Coderetreats by joining us on Slack, on Twitter. I even have a little slide here that I can show everyone. I hope it's you can see it. So you can visit us on the website coderetreat.org, where you can find many more info about how you can host and facilitate the Coderetreat. If you want to get in touch with us, the people that are organizing the Global Day of Coderetreat, the event that is happening once a year, you can find us on Twitter at coderetreat.org and on Slack on softwarecrafters.slack.com on the channel Coderetreat. With that being said, thank you once again, Alistair, for joining us. And thank you everyone to the ones that joined us live. And that's pretty much it. Thank you and have a nice evening. Bye-bye.
Take care, Aline. Bye.